Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. This is the Fast Friday edition of the show for January 15th, 2021. And on this episode, I'm talking about our real constitutional crisis, not the day-to-day political drama that most people get really worked up about. A lot of that stuff is really bad, but they're generally just symptoms of the problem, symptoms of the real deeper crisis, not the root cause. So today I'm going to cite a really interesting article published over at Future of Freedom Foundation by Lawrence Vance. Plus, I've got great quotes from leading founders like Thomas Jefferson, Samuel Adams, John Jay, James Madison, George Washington, and more. And I'm going to talk about our real constitutional crisis. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage has everything you need to follow this program, all the archives of the show for over 2.5 years. On individual episodes, I include links to articles, previous episodes, original source documents, and more so you can read, watch, listen, and learn more on your own time. I've got a bunch of goodies for today. You can also find all the different platforms we're on. Of course, we're on the mainstream ones, but we also have places like library.tv, LBRY.tv, Odyssey.com, BitChute, BitTube, and then we have all the podcast editions, Apple Podcasts, where I appreciate all the reviews that have been coming in, Spotify, Stitcher, Podbean, iHeartRadio, and elsewhere. And you can even find our membership program where you can put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month, and we make it go a long, long way in support of the Constitution and liberty. That show homepage is 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. It's all spelled out. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And I couldn't be more grateful for you spending some of your time with me today. Thank you so much for being here, whether it's your first time or you've been here for every single episode since day one. Thank you, thank you, thank you. But since it's Fast Friday, I promise to not take up too much of your time. Let's see if I can get this info out to you in the next 10 to 15 minutes-ish. And I want to first start out with this article that was published a little while ago over at the Future of Freedom Foundation, FFF.org. Of course, it'll be linked in the show notes. Here's Lawrence Vance. He says there are about 30 enumerated congressional powers listed throughout the Constitution. Most of them are found, 18, in Article 1, Section 8. He says 6 of them concern the militia and military. 4 of them concern taxes and money. The rest relate to commerce, naturalization, bankruptcies, post offices and post roads, copyrights and patents, the federal courts, maritime crimes, and the governance of the District of Columbia. I've got an interesting resource page that I don't cite very often over here at 10thamendmentcenter.com. It's just the title is 30 enumerated powers. I'll link to that in the show notes as well so you can find it pretty easily, but you could Google that as or whatever search engine, start page, whatever. 30 enumerated powers. It just breaks down the fact that there, you've got Article 1, Section 8, but plus there's other powers delegated to Congress throughout the document, and we just have a nice bullet point list. It's a good resource. Now back to Lawrence Vance, and I want to thank Patricia Dance from Syracuse, New York, a longtime supporter and listener of the show, who was talking about ignorance on Wednesday's episode in the comments during the live stream. And she was citing ignorance as maybe the biggest problem we face today. And I think she's on to something. I'm not sure if I think it's the number one, but it certainly is a big one. And Lawrence talks about this as well in this article. He says, the ignorance that most Americans have of the Constitution is exceeded only by the ignorance, exceeded by the ignorance of the Constitution that most congressmen have. Members of Congress swear to uphold the Constitution. Article 6, Clause 3 requires that senators and representatives be, quote, bound by oath or affirmation to support this Constitution. And this has probably got some sarcasm in it. So I'll throw a little in of my own on this. He says, one would think that members of Congress, most of whom have at least a bachelor's degree and many of whom are lawyers, would have a firm grasp of what the Constitution says, yet they are often the worst offenders when it comes to violations of the Constitution. And I would think that many of these people are aware of what it says. They are aware of some of the original legal arguments, the originalist arguments in support of limiting federal power. And those who are really excited to know that the general public is incredibly ignorant about them, because then they can get away with doing whatever they want. Others, of course, are just plain ignorant or don't care. Now, Thomas Jefferson warned us about this, and this was a letter that he wrote from a letter he wrote to Charles Yancey in January of 1816, January 6th. This is a paraphrase. He says, "If a nation expects to be ignorant and free, it expects what never was and never will be." He was far from alone in being concerned about ignorance. Samuel Adams, some years earlier, this is October of 1772, he regularly wrote essays in the Boston Gazette under a pseudonym. This one was as Valerius Papacola, I think it was. Again, October 1772, he says, "It is in the interest of tyrants to reduce the people to ignorance and vice." Going further, "For they cannot prevail in any country where virtue and knowledge prevail." So government people who want more power, want us all to be dumb. They want us all to be ignorant. They want us to be unaware. They want us to be fighting with each other as well, rather than learning and finding out that the great source of our problems comes from government. Here's John Jay with a similar vein. He was the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court nominated by George Washington. And this was a letter to Thomas Jefferson in October of 1786. He says, "The knaves and fools of this world are forever in alliance." Very similar message there from Samuel Adams, from Thomas Jefferson, from John Jay, and hopefully you're getting the same thing from me. I'm just basically, I'm the mouthpiece here. I'm just repeating this wisdom that we got from the founders. So back to Lawrence Vance. He says there currently is he had a long section, and this was an article talking about the protests that happened over the summer. And of course, he cited some other major problems like the Patriot Act as being a constitutional crisis, but there's currently a crisis, and it has existed long before those things. He says it's a crisis that has been perpetrated by both political parties in Congress, approved by the president, sanctioned by the Supreme Court, and carried out by bureaucrats who administer the myriad departments, bureaus, agencies, corporations, endowments, commissions, administrations, authorities, and boards of the federal government. Going further, he writes that the Constitution wasn't even 10 years old when the first constitutional crisis took place. And I think we're going to see a little pattern here. He says in 1798, in the name of national security, the Federalist majority in Congress passed and President John Adams signed into law 4 pieces of legislation known collectively as the Alien and Sedition Acts, which, as if you're a regular reader of the 10th Amendment Center, or you follow our work or listen to this program, you know Thomas Jefferson and James Madison first formalized, they didn't create it, first formalized the principles of nullification and interposition on paper in response to those hated Alien and Sedition Acts later that year in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions of 1798. Now, I would only have a small disagreement with Lawrence on this. This was a major one. It certainly drove Jefferson and Madison to take action to urge the states to resist. But there were other crises, if we're talking about it in the vein that he is, that is an exercise of power which is not delegated to the government in the first place. And that'll make a little bit more sense in a moment. But I go a little further back. We often hear that 1913 was a bad year for the Constitution and liberty, but so was 1791. We have the first Bank of the United States and the whiskey tax. And I covered, this is one of my favorite history episodes that I've done, George Washington and the Whiskey Rebellion. It was the summer of 2020 when I did that. And it's the real history behind what happened, not the kind of cartoonishy version that most people hear about. But I encourage you to check out that episode and read the linked source documents that I include as well. I will include that in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Now, going back to Lawrence's article, and he talks about other things. What he's really saying is the crisis here, which comes through loud and clear to me, is when government exercises power that has never been delegated to it. That, in essence, really is the root cause. That is our real constitutional crisis. I've got a warning about that from George Washington in a moment, but here are some other examples that Lawrence gives. He says the existence of Social Security is a constitutional crisis. Now, there's a sacred cow, right? Not only is it immoral because it takes money from those who work and it gives it to those who don't, the Constitution nowhere authorizes the federal government to have a retirement program, a pension plan, a forced savings account, or a disability plan. Or, for example, this one, and I've covered this as well. I should have had a link to the episode that I did on it. He says the existence of the war on drugs is a constitutional crisis. Not only is the drug war a failure and a colossal waste of money, nowhere does the Constitution authorize the federal government to regulate, monitor, or restrict Americans' consumption, medical or recreational habits, what Americans put in their mouths, noses, veins, or lungs, or Americans' eating, drinking, or smoking habits. And here's some more examples. The existence of federal aid to education is also a constitutional crisis. With that aid, of course, comes strings attached and directions. Nowhere, he writes, and that was my aside, he says, nowhere does the Constitution authorize the federal government to have a Head Start program, student loans, Pell Grants, teacher education or certification requirements, school accreditation, math and science initiatives, a Department of Education, remember that one? An Elementary and Secondary Education Act, a Higher Education Act, special education mandates or national standards, or have anything to do with the education of anyone's children. The existence of the welfare state. Again, they're not authorized to have food stamps, refundable tax credits, Section 8 housing vouchers, and title programs. All charity says should be private and voluntary, or if it's going to be government done, it should be reserved to the states and under the terms of the state constitutions. Here's James Madison in a debate in Congress, January 10th, 1794. He says, the government of the United States is a definite government, confined to specified objects. It is not like state governments, whose powers are more general. Charity is no part of the legislative duty of the government. That was a speech in the House of Representatives on January 10th, 1794. And what we're really talking about is usurpation of power. Usurpation is when government exercises power not delegated to it in the Constitution. It is a theft. It is stealing. St. George Tucker, as you may have heard me say, in 1803, he called it treason against the sovereignty of the people. Sovereignty meaning final authority. And the final authority of the people is that government is only authorized to exercise these powers and nothing more, and everything else is reserved to the people in the states as the people of each state determine. Then every time they do something, they're stealing that final authority. George Washington warned us about usurpation. In his farewell address in 1796, he says, "Let there be no change by usurpation. For though this in one instance may be the instrument of good, it is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed." Customary weapon. Usurpation of power is not just something that one side does to the other and then the other side does back and forth and back and forth. It's not just something to do things that you like or you hate. It is actually a weapon. It is a weapon to destroy freedom, according to George Washington. And here's Vance again in summary. He says, what is so perplexing and frustrating about the massive constitutional crisis that the United States is in is that it could quickly and easily be fixed. And I like how simple he puts it. He says, all federal programs that are not explicitly authorized by the Constitution should be eliminated. All federal departments, bureaus, agencies, corporations, endowments, commissions, administrations, authorities, and boards that carry out functions not explicitly authorized by the Constitution should be shuttered. Now, we know that will never, ever happen if we rely on the federal government to limit itself. And that's why before we head out, I'm going to cite one more episode that I did just in November, a couple of months ago, nullification and introduction. If we rely on Washington, D.C. to limit its own power, we shouldn't be surprised when that power grows, no matter which side is in power in Washington. It is up to we, the people of the several states, to learn how to defend the Constitution and exercise our rights, whether the central government wants us to or not. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was a fun, entertaining show today. I'm pretty hyped up about this, and I hope you learned something. If you support what we're doing, make sure to smash the like button, leave a comment, a review on Apple Podcasts or any other platform. That all helps get the program out to more people. And of course, nothing helps do more than that. Do that more than our membership program, where you can support us for as little as $2 a month. That's 10thamendmentcenter.com/members, all spelled out. Don't feel any pressure to join in, but if you're able to, I'd be extremely grateful for your financial support. Again, I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you have a great weekend, and I'll see you next week here on the Path to Liberty.